Republicans dead. Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay?
The women with the least likelihood of getting pregnant are the ones most worried about having abortions.
On January 6th of 2021, you had tens of thousands of people peacefully protesting.
No, it's not a right-wing conspiracy theory. It's not QAnon. It's real.
Hey folks, it's Rick Wilson. Welcome back to the Enemies List podcast. I'm your host as always, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Alex Isenstadt. He is a reporter for Axios. You know him from Axios and Politico and a couple other places over the years, but is a guy with a very, very deep tie into the story behind the story of the 2024 election. His new book is called Revenge, the inside story of Trump's return to power. It is absolutely riveting. It comes out in a couple of days, and I wanted to interview Alex today because there are some stories already popping out of this book. But I wanted to ask you first, Alex, talk to us about your biggest takeaway from the story of Trump's 2024 campaign. What is it that was the missing element that people weren't following about this campaign?
Yeah, here's the thing about Trump, and the reason he won this election in the most sort of simple way possible was because he connected with a swath of the American public that has felt disconnected from the elites in Washington, New York, LA, San Francisco. He connected with them. They saw him as a vessel. They saw him as this ascendant underdog figure. And a lot of the things that people thought were going to weigh Trump down, whether it was his trials, whether it was January 6th, they actually ended up in a weird way, it helped him in a strange way because his supporters and a lot of people who are struggling saw him as one of their own. They identified with him, and he became sort of this resurgent fighter figure. Now, the question is, we see that Trump is great at fighting. We see he's great at winning campaigns, but does that necessarily translate to governing? But in terms of this campaign, those things worked.
So in the course of this campaign, Donald Trump, again, he faced a lot of headwinds of his own making. But he also had something that the Democrats have had a lot of trouble grappling with from the very beginning, and that is that Trump has become an avatar for a lot of those voters that you mentioned, of this sort of ongoing sense of cultural disconnection from Washington, from Hollywood, from New York, from everywhere, that they feel is being imposed upon them. And they think it's secular. They think it's sexually different from their belief sets in terms of trans issues, all this. Talk to us about how he used that culture war to very great effect in the 2024 campaign.
Well, one of the things he did towards the end of the campaign, one of the most remarkable things was this spree of podcast interviews he went on, which really allowed him to reach, and this is just one example, but young men,
Sure.
Young men who felt very disconnected from the mainstream media, who feel forgotten about. You look at some of the interviews he did during the final weeks of the campaign. He did people like Theo Vaughn, like Joe Rogan. That was a really important part of that last month. And it's one of the things I go into in this book, which was that Brat Summer, as some of your listeners will recall, turned into Bro Fall. And it really helped him by going on places like Theo Vaughn, by going on places like Joe Rogan, it helped him lock in the male vote. And that really ended up helping him win this election.
I think that's exactly right. And I think you cover it in a way, because there was an article of faith in every single public and private survey that was out there last year that abortion was hurting Trump. And it was. It absolutely was not helping Trump. But while that abortion question was not helping Trump, the bro issue Harris never had a countervailing approach to that. There was never a question of how she was going to talk to male voters in a way that mattered to them. And I think that those two ended up being a wash. And Trump ended up, using that cultural relevance he had in that space. When we look at him gaining with 18 to 40-year-old white men, which is already a pretty good group for him. We look at him gaining with Hispanic men, 18 to 30. We look at him gaining with African-American men, 18 to 30. The numbers aren't gigantic, but they were decisive.
That's right. I mean, you look at what his campaign managed to do. They saw an opportunity to sort of make small slices into the Democratic coalition, right? Winning among black men, making gains among black men, making gains among Latino voters. They were able to sort of take small steps by going into barbershops in Detroit, or by taking some other steps to win over male voters and other. They were able to do small things, and that cut away at the traditional Democratic coalitions. One of the things that they did that was really important were those trans ads that you saw them play at the end.
That was my next question.
Yep. Yeah. And that was something that really helped them win over male voters, black voters. Those ads played very heavily during sporting events, and that in turn helped them win over a lot of male voters. It's
ironic because the trans ads, we were talking to Democrats at the time. They're like, "This is horrible. This is hateful. These are obscene. This is this," and they never said, "And our response is going to be X." It was always like, ignore it, it'll go away. And I remember I talked to a group of Democratic major donors in the end of the summer last year. And I said, as a former Republican who used to do this, I can tell you they never spend this much money on something that doesn't work. And it worked. It was working. And I think their denial of that is something where they need to have some really serious self-examination. But that culture war was what helped Trump win this thing. I also want to ask you about, we had a heated Republican primary, surprisingly so. It was always inevitable what was going to happen, but that primary left a lot of, I want to ask you, like, how did Trump feel about the primary as it was going on?
At the beginning, there was a lot of consternation about Ron DeSantis, your fellow Floridian, at the beginning of the primary, where Trump very much felt this sting of disloyalty towards DeSantis. He felt that, and perhaps rightly so, that he made DeSantis, that Ron DeSantis wouldn't be governor without his help. There was an enormous effort on the part of the Trump campaign to destroy Ron DeSantis. They pitched out opposition research on him like nobody's business. They pushed out a story about him, and who knows how much of this is true. They pushed out a story about Ron DeSantis that he rode his golf cart behind his wife to make her lose weight after her pregnancy. They put out stories about how he kept dirty underwear in his house gym locker. There were a number of different stories that they put out about Ron DeSantis and Trump, and it was all because Trump wanted to destroy Ron DeSantis. He wanted to make it so that Ron DeSantis, not only would he lose the primary, but that he would never win anything ever again. And so DeSantis ended up getting steamrolled, and most of the consternation about the primary took place earlier on in the campaign in early to mid 2023. Concerns about DeSantis really ended up abating towards the end of 2023. You had this period of concern from the Trump people about Nikki Haley, but they were never that concerned, really. She never really ended up gaining as much traction as she would have liked.
I think Nikki Haley was, and I wrote about this a lot, and I think you sort of captured this too. There were things about Nikki Haley that were more formidable than DeSantis as a communicator. DeSantis was more of an organizational. I think they were right to have a little early agita about DeSantis because he was raising good money. He did have competent people around him, but Susie Wiles, who had a very ugly ending with DeSantis, was clearly in Trump's ear almost from the beginning on this. And at that point, it just wasn't, there wasn't a world where Donald Trump let DeSantis off the mat in this whole thing. So that primary, though, it did give a moment of I guess at least a moment of hesitation in their hearts, like, are we, we're going to win this thing in the end, but why is this happening?
Well, there was actually a moment where when DeSantis, if you go back to the post midterms of 2022, right?
Mm-hmm.
There were a lot of people in the Republican Party who were blaming Trump for the party's failure, for the Republican Party's failure to do well in that midterm election.
Sure.
And right after that, you head into late November and December of 2022. Mm-hmm. Trump has a Kanye West dinner. He puts
Nick
out
Fuentes, right.
He puts out that tweet where he appears to be challenging the Constitution. He does that thing where he puts out like baseball cards, NFT type things, and there were people in. So DeSantis is ascendant. DeSantis just has this blowout re-election victory in Florida. Trump is struggling at this point, and you have people within Trump's campaign who are going, "Oh boy, we've got a real problem on our hands." And at that point, in very early January 2023, there was actually very real concern among Trump's team that this was going to be a lot harder and that he was potentially way off track. Things didn't get better for Trump until he made that trip with J.D. Vance soon after to that train derailment in East Palestine, Ohio. And that was the moment where he really figured out, this is the thrust of my campaign, to attach myself and to connect myself with the sort of forgotten people, the people who, in his argument, Joe Biden had left behind. And it was interesting that was where he and J.D. Vance first really connected. They knew each other during the 2022 campaign, but that was where that relationship really moved forward.
Okay. So speaking of Vance, talk to me a little bit about, because I've heard from inside that world a couple different variations. One is that was a fairly open question at one point, and another person who I think is pretty reliable, who said to me it was always going to be Vance at one level, that he had somehow made it in his head that was about the Ohio thing. It was about Vance being that the right sort of middle class or working class background made good story was compelling to Trump. Talk to us about that a little bit.
So J.D. Vance, if you look back on it in hindsight, he always had a major advantage. Why? Because he had Donald Trump Jr. in his corner, and that was always going to be a massive advantage. He also had people like Charlie Kirk in his corner. He had people like Tucker Carlson in his corner, and that gave J.D. Vance a huge advantage. Burgum was being pushed by Rupert Murdoch, and that's why Burgum made it pretty far into this whole process. You had a situation where Rupert Murdoch told Burgum, if you want to win with Trump, what you have to do is you just have to call him again and again and again and again. It got to the point where Rupert Murdoch was calling Trump so much, the Trump people were getting tired of it. But in the end, it was Donald Trump Jr. who really stuck the knife in Doug Burgum, and that's how J.D. Vance was picked.
Right. Well, I do think that for the Burgum being such an off-axis, like there weren't a lot of strong motivations to hire Doug Burgum. He's okay on TV, but he's not great on TV. And Vance certainly seemed to know how to play the game inside the family better than Burgum ever could have managed, I think.
100%. And, you look back on it, I think J.D. Vance was a pretty obvious pick. But look, I mean, he said some pretty negative things about Trump in the past. He called Trump America's Hitler. So
right.
That.
Just that.
So in some ways, it wasn't always a sure thing. But when you look back on it, it made the most sense that he was going to pick J.D. Vance for sure.
Right. So the book is called Revenge. Who is Trump, aside from just the obvious people who tried to, in his mind, prosecute or persecute him? Who else is he seeking revenge on as he's president now in a second term?
I think it's anyone he sees as getting in his way. He sees whether it's the Democratic Party, whether it is people like Jack Smith, whether it is people in the DOJ who investigated him at any one point. He is out for revenge. He's out for payback against a wide swath of people. in some ways a much bigger swath of people than I think a lot of people expected. And it's been remarkable to watch. But if you're at this point, if you're a House Republican or if you're a Senate Republican who tries to stop him, you have to bet that Trump is going to use his political operation to spend money against you, that he's going to try to wage a primary against you. He's someone who's very much thinking in terms of payback right now.
So that is something that, there's been some writing in the last few days, some reporting in the last few days that, Chris LaCivita is right now bashing heads with Thomas Massie and other holdouts on the Trump budget idea in the House for the CR. That political machine that Trump has and that willingness to go at these people, I think it actually masks a larger weakness inside the caucus. Is you can only govern by fear for so long, and after a point, if you have all the numbers on your side, fear works. But right now, the economy is starting to look a little tenuous. Trump is not has not delivered the golden age that people that a lot of his voters actually did expect. That belief about Trump from his voters that he is this economic genius is the most impermeable polling artifact I've ever seen in my life. No matter what he does, people, he's a businessman, he's great at this, he understands the economy. And yet, what does the Republican caucus look like in 6 months or 7 months when the campaign of 2026 is really on? And economic peril, not only from the trade wars and DOGE and everything else that is not as popular. How does Trump's power hold up, do you think, with both Republicans and the country, when he does look like a guy who's just out for revenge, just out for, settling scores, all those things?
So I think there are two different questions there, right? Which is that it's very possible that you have a situation where his approval ratings really start to plummet, especially if you continue to see the NASDAQ go down 4% every day. It's only a matter of time before your approval rating starts to take a hit. But you have this whole other question, which is that does Trump remain popular within the Republican Party? So if Trump is popular within the Republican Party, he can still spend a lot of money, and Elon Musk can spend a lot of money for that matter, instilling fear in Republicans to stay behind his agenda. But if his approval ratings within the Republican Party start to crack, then things get a little tougher for him. But Trump's hold over his base and his hold over the Republican Party has always given him an enormous amount of sway and an ability to instill fear in Republicans on Capitol Hill. So the question is, does that change? And do Republican voters start to say, this isn't what we hoped it would be?
Yeah, that's really, I think, the central question here is, do you reach a point where Republican voters say, what golden age are we in? What exactly? Prices have increased, not gone down. We voted for lower gas prices and for lower grocery prices, not for Gaza and Greenland. And I do think there's a little there, just like Trump sliced off pieces of the Democratic coalition. I think that there's a discontent, small but discontent piece of the Republican. They won't necessarily say it publicly yet. Of the Republican world, that's like, we're not Putin's guys. What's going on there, boss? And tariffs? Are you kidding me? Tariffs? What? I feel like there's a little bit of target acquisition that Democrats could be doing with some of these folks. But this revenge, I think that you write so eloquently about here, he is going after the people in the DOJ that he believes persecuted or prosecuted him, that he believes were part of Russia, the Russia hoax, as he calls it. That's going to be a very loud and ugly process, I think. And Kash Patel and Pam Bondi, I don't believe are going to ever say, yeah, no, boss, you're going too far here. How does that play out politically for him? And Trump will spend, I think, a lot of bandwidth on that. So how do you see that whole story playing out? Because it really is a deep motivation for him, this hatred of those folks.
I think there's going to be a purge. I don't think there's anything that can really stop it at this point. It's nothing like, and one of the things that I think is really interesting comparing this Trump administration from the last Trump administration is that you had people who were in, if you think about who entered the last Trump administration, it was this sort of hodgepodge of different people, some of whom were totally behind everything Trump did, some of whom were a little like, I don't know. And you had a very diverse group of people. The people who are behind Trump right now, it is a small, tight group. They're very close to Susie Wiles, and they're going to be behind what Trump does. They're going to support what he does. And so in the last few days, you've seen some pushback among the cabinet towards Elon Musk. But broadly speaking, there's a lot less resistance and a lot less infighting going on. And so if Trump wants payback against someone, there's a lot less pushback against that. Whereas in the first Trump term, you had a variety of different people, a variety of different interests. Trump didn't know what he wanted as much then. He didn't know what he was doing as much. He was totally new. So you had people like Reince Priebus, you had people like Kellyanne Conway, and then you had Steve Bannon. All these people had different agendas, different interests. Some of them wanted to push back on Trump. That's a lot less the case this time. So if Trump wants payback against someone, there's a good chance he's going to push forward and he's going to get it.
Right. And I think with Trump and as a sort of historical artifact with Trump, he is always a guy who he will press and press and press as hard as he can on people who work for him and who are loyal to him until they either walk away or he pushes them away. As happened in the first administration, you saw the fall off of the adults in the room. And you're right, there are no adults in the room now. There are no grown-ups in the room. This is all about absolute loyalty to a guy who he has learned enough about government to be more dangerous than he was the first time around, in my view.
Here's the interesting thing for your listeners to think about, which is back during the first Trump term, you had, when something happened that was controversial, say something around tariffs, you had a number of stories that came out, palace intrigue stories about leaks, about people pushing back against tariffs or whatever it was. You don't have that this time around. You've seen people in the business community and others saying, whoa, this may not be working well, the market's down. But last time around, you would have seen a flood of stories of leaks of people saying, we don't support this. We tried to talk him down from it. You don't have that happening this time around. He has a small, tight-knit group around him that they're very loyal to him, and they're going to help him push his agenda forward no matter what it is.
You mentioned Susie Wiles as sort of the behind-the-scenes major domo here, and she is, no question. And Susie's a smart person. I know Susie, Florida politics for generations. I've been picking up a little bit, not a ton, but a little bit of tension exists between Susie and Elon, that she can't help Trump if Elon is running as roughshod as Elon has been running inside of the administration. Where do you think that ends up with? I think my opinion is that Elon is probably already past peak in terms of his ability to influence things, but his money will keep him in the fight for a long time. How does Susie manage the sort of chaos side of this? Because there was a sort of tacit understanding with a lot of the big money folks. Susie's a normie. Susie's going to take care of things. This isn't going to be as crazy as last time, as the wilderness years were, etc. Where do you see that sort of Susie Elon Trump relationship ending up?
Elon is such a here's the problem with inviting such a powerful, wealthy person into your administration, which is that Elon Musk really can do whatever he wants. He can go start a $1 billion super PAC if he wants to and target someone. He doesn't really, if something doesn't turn out well on the DOGE side, doesn't really matter to him. He just goes back to his other companies. And so for most other politicians, cabinet members, they have to worry about their reputations. They have to worry about their next steps in their career. They need to worry about their relationships. For Elon Musk, he doesn't really have that. He says, sorry. So there's a danger and there is a drawback to inviting someone into your cabinet or someone into your administration who is that powerful, because they're not really answerable to anyone. They can get fired. You can fire him technically, but you don't want him to be on your bad side, because
walking around a couple $1 billion
Yeah.
just for play money. And, or somebody said to me yesterday or day before yesterday, the worst scenario for Trump is that he and Elon break up and Elon just takes his finger off the trigger on Twitter and stops using that normative force of Twitter to keep the MAGA faithful in line, and that Trump sort of goes back to a natural level of gravity where the MAGA base has gotten very accustomed to, this is our hub now. This is where all the truth is fed to us about Trump. And if that went away, my friend was arguing that's Elon's superpower, not just the money.
Trump is like a lot of politicians. He's a leverage player, right? He looks for leverage over people. The reality is he just has a lot less leverage over Elon Musk. He's the richest person in the world. And so you got to be careful.
Depending on where the stock market is this morning.
Right. So, Musk is a potential problem for Trump. If they decide that Musk is a bigger problem than he was in the beginning, that if he brings more negatives than positives to the table, and they decide they don't want Musk around anymore, they got to be very careful in terms of how they edge him out. Because if you piss Elon Musk off, he could become a real problem for you guys down the road.
I think that to my mind is the devil's bargain that they made with Elon, and look, for both Trump and Elon in the short term, it paid off remarkably. But Donald Trump is a guy with a very keen sort of sense of self-preservation, I think, and about what affects his numbers. And I wonder how long, because Elon is not as popular as Trump, and what DOGE is doing is not as popular as Trump had hoped it would be, or Elon hoped it would be. And I'm just curious, like, when does Trump pull that ripcord? Because I think there has to be a day there where, even with all Elon's money and positional power, that somebody says, hey, boss, we're going to get blown the hell out in the midterms. And, hey, boss, this isn't helping you with anything at this point. So I don't know. It just, and maybe some of that's wish casting, but I find that in my very long period of time in politics, nobody defies gravity forever.
Right. Well, I mean, the Democratic Party right now, I mean, it's obviously ways till the midterms, but if you're starting to think about running ads and you're a Democratic Party strategist, the first boogeyman you're thinking about is probably Elon Musk at this point.
100%. Because look, as we've discovered in my work, attacking Trump head on with his strongest voters produces what I call the immune reaction. Even if it's factual, even if it's real, even if it's terrible, there are things about Trump, that bond he has with his voters, where they just look at you and go, nope, don't believe it. Nope, not listening. Nope, he's the man. And I think that is a space where Elon doesn't have the same degree of protection from those voters that Trump does. He doesn't have the same superpower of an image that they have come to associate, as you point out, with the working man and protecting the little guy and being part of the similar offended and oppressed minority in their minds. Elon doesn't have that same degree of armor, I guess. But I think Elon's on a clock. I still have to believe it. So let me ask you a couple more questions before we wrap up here, because I want people to read this book, because I do think anytime you understand that Trump is a smaller character in some ways than people think. There's this one image of Trump, this massive historical thing, but he's not as big a man. He really is about a lot of his own personal grievances a lot of the time. Tell me what you learned about Trump in writing this book that was revelatory about his character that you didn't know going in?
Well, what I learned is that he, in some ways, I'll tell you what I learned. I became more impressed by his political skills and his political acumen than I understood him to be a better political athlete than I initially recognized. There's something about him that he has a unique feel for what buttons to press. He has a unique feel for how to reach people, how to stir the pot, how to get people's emotions and how to bring people to his side. There are all kinds of questions about whether he can govern effectively, but there's no question at this point that he knows how to fight effectively. And so that's something that I learned about is, and I try for this to be sort of a fair-minded book. And so what I tried to do is understand him and who he is. And I think that what came through to me is that this is a guy who, no matter what you think about him, and the country is so polarized around him. Either you think he's the end of democracy or you think he's a hero. But what I think that what everyone can agree on is that he is a political athlete that we haven't seen in a very long time.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, and I tell people this a lot. It's like, you don't have to think that Trump is a genius to understand he has a feral cunning about human emotions and about how people will respond in today's culture to what he's going to do and say. He understands those things at a basal kind of level, I think. The other question I had for you was, I look at the campaign as having two enormous inflection points. The first was what happened with Joe Biden and Donald Trump in the July debate, where we saw the end of Biden's campaign no matter what he wanted to do. What was Trump's thought at that debate? How did he walk in and out of that room in your reporting when Joe Biden just absolutely collapsed on stage, basically?
So this is actually something interesting I found, which is that going into that debate, Trump was very much focused and worried about one thing, which is that if I hit Biden too hard, could I knock him out of this race? Which is interesting because one would think that Trump always wants to hit everyone hard all the time. But Trump understood that if he hit Biden too hard, Biden might drop out of the race. And Trump's advisors were actually not in agreement with him on that. They said, no, that's not a problem. Don't worry about it. You just have to go in and do the best you can. Fight the fight you have to fight. And Trump said, no, look, if I hit Biden too hard, he might drop out of this race and then someone else comes in. And at the time, they were thinking about other people. Could Gavin Newsom get in? Trump initially thought Gavin Newsom was a very formidable figure. There was a time where Trump was actually worried about Gavin Newsom. But what you had was a situation going into this debate where Trump was concerned about it. And he ended up being right. And so that was kind of the mindset that Trump had going into this debate. He took the debate process and preparation, unlike the second debate with Kamala Harris, he took the first debate with Biden very seriously.
Right. The other inflection point, I think, in this whole thing, and I want to get your views on how this changed him, was the assassination attempt in Pennsylvania. Talk to us about what you've learned in your reporting about that moment and how that psychologically altered the sort of space that Trump lived in.
Trump was deeply shaken, understandably so, by that assassination attempt, very understandably so. His friends in the weeks after, they saw someone who was very different emotionally. They saw someone who was changed. He was a lot more scared of dying than he publicly let on, again, understandably so. And he said the morning after the assassination attempt, he said, if that bullet had been just a hair closer, and the quote was that my brain would have exploded like a watermelon on live television. That's how he saw it. He was a different figure in some ways emotionally to those who are his friends, to those who know him closely. They saw a very different figure in those weeks after the assassination attempt. And when you look at the assassination attempt followed by Biden's dropping out of the race, this was a very shaken president for a few weeks there. And that month after Kamala Harris got out was arguably the most rocky moment of Trump's campaign. There were serious questions about whether Trump had the discipline at that point to win the race. You remember what happened in Georgia when he attacked Brian Kemp. So you remember when he questioned Kamala Harris's racial heritage. That happened afterwards. He had some very rocky moments in that month after the assassination attempt and after Biden dropped out. And a lot of his friends believe that he was emotionally shaken during that time.
I think that is obviously, being shot at is a horrifying and life-changing experience. And I think that's one of the things that also bonded him more closely to his base, where they had this psychological connection to him that now he wasn't just their avatar, he was their martyr. He was willing to take a bullet for America, all that stuff. I think you can't underscore the degree to which that had a bonding effect between Trump and his followers.
Yeah. And if one thinks about it, it's like if you just get shot at and your first instinct is to raise your hand in the air and say fight, which really encapsulates Trump's relationship with his base, that's a very visceral understanding of his supporters that he would have and that he has. And I don't think most politicians would have done that in that moment.
Yeah, say what you will. The guy understands the theatrics and the spectacle of moments, and that was certainly one of them. Well, Alex Isenstadt, I want to thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. Folks, get this book. It is called Revenge, The Inside Story of Trump's Return to Power. It is a look at the psychology and the politics that led us to this moment. It is a great inside campaign story in the tradition. I'm going to date myself now of the sort of Jack Germond and Jules Whitcover kind of campaign bios where you're inside the room, where you get the inside story. It is a terrific book. I encourage you to get it. Alex Isenstadt, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me, Rick. Really appreciate it.
You bet. So there's a story out right now, and I don't know if it's true or not, but it has rattled me in a way that I think has a bigger impact on it. And the story is this. There are multiple reports now out of Ukraine from Ukrainian troops on the front line that when they turn on their Starlink systems, Russians immediately attack them with drones or artillery. I don't know if it's true or not. I don't. But I can tell you, Elon Musk has previously put his thumb on the scale of Starlink. Yes, he owns the company, but no, he's not paying for these out of the goodness of his heart. He's being paid to deploy these systems by the Poles and by other European countries. If he has given the Russians a backdoor into Starlink, if he has given the Russians the ability to target, because Starlink, it's obviously coordinated, it knows exactly where you are so that the beam splitters can appropriately aim the signal to the terminal. If he has given a backdoor to Russia into Starlink, it is an obscenity of the highest degree. You are not, Elon, a nation state. You may be rich. You're less rich than you were because you're fucking up and Tesla's going into the dumper and your stock price is down in massive numbers and your sales are down by cataclysmic meltdown levels that you have hardly even begun to imagine. But if you flipped off the Starlink system because you decided on your own that you want to help Russia, that's one thing. And you did that when you forbade them from targeting targets in Crimea using Starlink. But if you're giving the Russians assistance in targeting the Ukrainian troops on the ground, I wouldn't give 10 fucking cents to be you in this world. If you're costing the lives of Ukrainian troops by giving the Russians the coordinates for where those folks are, who are defending their lives, their homes, their country, I assure you there will be a price to be paid for that. You are, for a billion reasons, on the enemies list. That's enough.